And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guests and speakers for today's session. From the HTFC Planning and Design Group, I guess we can call them. We'll begin with Flora Beardy. Flora Beardy is an NANAKACIHTAKEWIN Cree woman born and raised in York Factory First Nation traditional territory located between KISCHI and Churchill, Manitoba. Flora is an elder, mother, community champion, and historian. She holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Manitoba for her work documenting the oral history of the York Factory people. She has published a book of NAMAO oral history titled Voices from the Hudson Bay and has received awards of excellence from Canada Heritage and the National Treasury Board. Flora has worked as an interpreter and board member with Parks Canada and as a researcher, translator, committee member, and elder advisor for her community. Next, Elly Bonny. Elly is a principal with HTFC Planning and Design in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Elly holds an honors degree in environmental biology from Queen's University and a master's degree in natural resources management from the University of Manitoba. Elly Bonny's work centers on Indigenous connections to the land and in supporting communities to manage lands and resources in ways that reflect local values and knowledge. Her commitment to understand, document, and find ways to apply communities' perspectives applies equally to resource management, land use planning, and environmental assessment projects. Finally, Adam Kroeker. Adam is an associate and community planner at HTFC. He holds master's degrees in city planning and creative writing from the University of Manitoba. Adam Kroeker has worked with cities, rural municipalities, and Indigenous communities across the prairies and northern Canada on land use planning, environmental planning, tourism, and economic development projects. Having grown up on a grain farm in southern Manitoba, Adam has had a lifelong interest in the intersection between planning, food systems, and climate change. Over to you, folks.
Thank you, Bill, for the great introduction. We are very happy to be here today. As you have gathered, we're all coming at you from Manitoba. Adam and I are with HTFC Planning and Design, so we're logging in from Winnipeg. We are in Treaty 1 territory of the Anishinaabe and Cree, the unceded territory of the Dakota, and homeland of the Métis Nation. Flora is in her home community of York Landing, so she's about 700 kilometers north of us in Treaty 5 territory and of course her own ancestral Cree lands.
Everybody, and thank you for inviting us to talk with you today. I think this is a very important and timely topic, and we're excited to be talking to the next generation of folks that will be changing our world and being green citizens. And so in exploring the conference theme of today's challenge and tomorrow's opportunity, we wanted to share with you the story of one First Nation in northern Manitoba, and that is York Factory First Nation. So we at your HTFC Planning and Design have been working with York Factory since 2004 on a variety of projects, some of which we'll talk about today. And we're excited to tell you about what the nation is doing to steward and protect their lands. And we're also honored to have Elder Flora Beardy join us today in this presentation. So during our talk today, we're going to begin by looking at the past. We're going to be sharing information about the community's relationship to the land and traditional territory of the Hudson Bay coast before they were forcibly relocated to a new community over 200 kilometers away with a totally different environment. We will then talk about changes to the land that have been experienced in this place as well as on the coast. And next, we'll share about the ways York Factory members have been caring for the land through a range of projects that are now underway. And we'll end by highlighting one of those projects, which is planning for a new Indigenous protected area in the traditional territory along the Hudson Bay coast. So this is part one, and we want to start by playing a short video that will give you a brief introduction to the land and people of York Factory First Nation.
Our traditional area covers a vast area along the Hayes River, York Factory, Port Nelson, along the coast up to and beyond KISCHI. This is where our people live all their lives. People enjoy living here because the land provided all the necessities to support their families, have good clean water, and unlimited space to enjoy outdoor recreational activities away from the community. There are plenty of wildlife, geese, ducks, moose, caribou, and fish available for people to hunt and to share with others who are less fortunate in their hunting trips. Fur-bearing animals were trapped in the fall and winter and sold to the Hudson Bay Company at York Factory. Things changed in 1957 when the Hudson Bay Company ceased operations at York Factory. We were then forced to move to an unknown location further inland, where we were promised a better life for our people.
I was born in York Factory, but I grew up in York Factory, and I've lived there for most of my life. We have grown up together, York Factory and I, and gone through many changes in the short time that our people have been there. There have been many changes for our community and our people since the 1960s, 1970s to now in hydro development activities. And we have done the best that we can to live with exchanges during this time.
All right, so that was a little introduction, and so now we can pass it over. Flora, you can tell us a bit more about this land and the relationship to it.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Good morning to everybody. Like said, my name is Flora Beardy. I'm a Cree elder with the York Factory First Nation. My beginnings started at a small settlement called KAWEKANAWYNICHIKATEK in northern Manitoba. My parents, Alec and Eliza Spence, were both from the York Factory area. I'm very proud to be here today to share with you the history of our Indigenous peoples of York Factory and also a brief history of the fur trade post. In the 1600s, European explorers and traders arrived in our territory, bringing a new economy and with it foreign ideas, languages, diseases, and Christianity. Europeans came with a perception of KITASKIINAN, the Cree word for our land, as a resource to feed European markets. They saw it as a place where title to land, rights to trade, and the power to make laws could be granted by a faraway king. A group of wealthy Englishmen, English merchants, formed the Hudson Bay Company in 1670. And the King of England granted the company a fur trade monopoly for all the lands drained by rivers flowing into Hudson Bay, even though the land did not belong to him or to his country. The Hudson Bay Company was formed. York Factory became a hub of the North American fur trade, an economy that was built on the knowledge and skills of our people. It was the INDIGENOUS who were able to harvest animals, prepare furs, secure food, and navigate the sometimes dangerous waterways of our territory. They became middlemen, guides, interpreters. The Home Guard Cree supplied labor, country food, and clothing for the Hudson Bay Company. For more than a century, the European visitors were stationed only at the Hudson Bay coast, collecting and shipping materials. Their knowledge of inland areas and transportation routes evolved gradually as explorers and traders learned from our ancestors. Our people ultimately shaped and were forever shaped by the fur trade. The expansion of the Hudson Bay Company, colonization, diseases, and the arrival of missionaries dramatically changed the lives of the KISCHI and Inuit, the York Factory Cree. Christianity changed the identity of the Cree, taking their Cree names and giving them Christian names. For example, ATIKWAK became John. NAMAO became Peter. Also, our traditional ceremonies were banned. Naming ceremonies were very important to our people when children were born. Ceremonies that were banned. Through the 20th century, a number of factors contributed to separate us from our ancestral lands and to erode our social and cultural well-being. With less work at York Factory and a declining fur company, many of our families moved away from the coastal area to pursue other livelihoods. Some went to the community of Gillam, Churchill, and to the Hudson Bay Railway to find employment. Then in 1957, the York Factory post was permanently closed, and government officials told the remaining families that they would be relocated to a site at a new location which would be identified by government officials. This forced relocation separated our people from the land that held our history, homes, relations, and even the graves of our loved ones. This collective trauma was amplified by the effects of residential schools and the loss of available harvesting and trapping areas. We refer to this period as a time of dispersal, one that carries heavy memories for our people. The forced relocation had a very dramatic effect on the families. The people didn't know where they were going, only knowing that they were leaving home. They were told to pack only what they could carry and leave out the rest of their items behind. Items that were left behind were like sewing machines, an item that was very important to women for making clothing and handicrafts. The men had to leave their traps, nets, sleds, and even dogs behind. The government had promised that these items would be picked up later and brought to the people, but that was a promise that was not kept. These people never got their items. Another effect on the people was the residential school era. Families were separated. Children as young as 4 and 5 were sent out to school for 10 months of the year. Some children never made it back. For some families, there was no closure. The effects of the residential school are still visible in our communities today. Despite the challenges of the past, York Factory First Nation is now working to rebuild our nation, politically, economically, spiritually, and culturally. We are pressing current governments to recognize and respect our existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, including promises to reserve land made over 100 years ago. We are pursuing economic development to reduce our dependence on government payments and raise the prosperity of our people. We are strengthening our governance, self-determination, and presence on our land. We are maintaining and strengthening our language, culture, and connection to our ancestral land along the Hudson Bay coast. We are reconciling and healing our wounds from the last century. We are rebuilding our community together. Our people have built a vibrant community at York Landing, which has become home to new generations of our members. York Landing is now home to our community. Our ancestral home continues to be at the coast. We remain deeply connected to our traditional territory. At every opportunity, we return to the coast to celebrate our community, land, and culture. Every fall, the First Nation contributes considerable resources to bring a few of our resource users to the coast to trap and hunt and fish, maintaining a connection and knowledge of the land, waters, and wildlife at the coast. Silver Goose was our first lodge, but today we have a modern camp at 10 Shilling Creek, which looks over the same water that our members have fished for the entirety of our oral history. Our people have always been very spiritual. We have practiced traditional spirituality for as long as we can remember. Many of our community members adopted Christianity in the 1800s. Today, our community maintains both traditional and Christian teachings. There is strength in both of these spiritual paths. Today, York Factory is a National Historic Site of Canada. 100 years after the adhesion to Treaty 5 was signed by Chief Westescott and his councillors, Robert and Sandy Beardy, York Factory First Nation held a gathering at the site, along with 4 sister First Nations. And these are Fox Lake Cree Nation, War Lake First Nation, Shamattawa First Nation, and KITASKIINAN Cree Nation. We are sister nations because all our ancestors came from these vast homelands along the Hudson Bay coast. And that was a very, very wonderful gathering. Yeah, we could feel the spirits of our ancestors joining us in our celebration. And at this time when we were at the gathering, my husband and I renewed our wedding vows. I think it was 47 years at that time. Today we're together 58 years. And it was just a great, wonderful time. And you could just feel the spirits of our ancestors there with us. So I know this this was a very brief history, but it is our land that we have along the coast is very, very important to us. Oh.
Thanks, Flora. Yeah, so we wanted to now talk about a few changes to the land. So as Flora mentioned, and as we heard, over the last several generations, the INDIGENOUS York Factory have been resilient to the forces of colonialism, the introduction of Western religion, and a trade economy into their communities and traditional territories. But they have adapted to these changes and retained much of their way of life, culture, and traditions. We also heard that in 1957, community members were moved from their traditional territory on the Hudson Bay lowlands and relocated to the southeast corner of Split Lake, became the community of York Landing. But in those 64 years since relocation, community members have experienced profound changes, including several significant environmental lands issues. So the first, so within months of the community resettling at York Landing, Manitoba Hydro built the Kelsey hydroelectric dam upstream. You can see both within a few months of time there. Community members' new homelands and waters were changed before they had barely begun to understand and learn about them. So in the 1970s, the Lake Winnipeg regulation and Churchill River diversion proceeded, again without any prior consultation with the Cree communities and without any environmental assessment and licensing. The Kettle generating station was completed downstream of York Landing in 1974, followed by the Long Spruce generating station in 1979 and the Limestone generating station in 1990. So because of these hydroelectric developments, the community's water quality declined dramatically. Shorelines were flooded and eroded, and the fish and animals became poorer in health and abundance. The community became defined as a Northern Flood Agreement community to outsiders, rather than a proud Cree community that shared vast territories, history, and culture with the Cree people now living in different places. And so today, the hydro impacts can be clearly seen around the community. Bear Ass Beach, once a prime spot to swim in the community, has now become full of rocks and not very usable. And you can see the same beach here in the flooding event of 2017, completely covered by the water, which will further contribute to the erosion of the shoreline areas. So events like flooding are becoming more common with climate change. Climates in northern Canada are some of the most rapidly changing in the entire world. In the coming decades, northern Manitoba is projected to experience a dramatic reduction in the number of cold days. So, for example, York Landing could lose virtually all of its minus 30 degrees Celsius days by the end of the century under a high carbon scenario. So this would be a loss of 6 weeks of minus 30-degree weather from what it was historically. So this is important because York Landing relies on a winter road across Split Lake for the delivery of food, fuel, construction supplies, and equipment, and other vital goods that are too large, heavy, or costly to fly in. So this map here, which HTFC prepared for York Factory First Nation using data provided by Manitoba Infrastructure, shows ice thickness on the winter road in mid-January 2019. So you can notice the significant amount of red on this map, areas where the ice may not have been thick enough to support the weight of a heavy truck. So the ongoing loss of cold weather in the future will further decrease the reliability and viability of this winter road. The challenges that climate change presents to the north will certainly have an effect on the unique landscape of York Factory First Nations traditional territory on the Hudson Bay coast and lowlands. So the Hudson Bay lowlands ecoregion is home to the largest wetland in North America. 90% of the Hudson Bay lowlands ecozone is covered in peatlands, making this one of the largest peatland areas in the world. The land contains critical maternal denning habitat for polar bears and is rich with other flora and fauna that have sustained life for the NANAKACIHTAKEWIN for millennia. It includes important habitat for ATIKWAK or caribou, both coastal and barren ground herds. It is breeding habitat for 128 bird species. It also hosts lake sturgeon, brook trout, wolverine, moose, and other species that have long been used by the community. And the area also includes important historical and cultural sites associated with long-standing Indigenous presence and the shorter-lived activity of the fur trade, and then the brief effort towards development of a rail terminus at Port Nelson between the 1912 and 1918. But conservation is needed needed right now to protect this important area from major resource development with negative impacts. Near the community, the 695 megawatt KIASK hydroelectric project and KIASK transmission project are just nearing completion as we speak. The KAWEKANAWAYNICHIKATEK converter station, which was recently completed, which feeds the 200 megawatt bipole 3 transmission line, which originates at the site. And then the area also continues to hold petroleum and mining potential, as well as the potential for future linear developments, including a fiber optic link to Nunavut. The First Nations have raised concerns about the impacts of such projects on caribou and sturgeon populations in the region, particularly in this context of a changing climate and fire regime. Elly, over to you.
All right, thanks, Adam. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the work that York is doing around managing and protecting its lands, in the context of the history that Flora shared and some of these natural resource values and wildlife values and development potential that Adam's spoken to. I think the real message is, even though the government has relocated York Factory people away from their homeland, it has moved them into a reserve community. It has given the provincial government, the power to approve mining or hydro development projects. The Cree people, the Innuak, are still tied to their traditional lands. They still have a duty to act as stewards to those lands and protect that land. And they're working to play as large a role they can in managing and being present and making decisions for their lands. Even if our provincial and our federal legislation isn't there yet, York Factory Cree are still there looking to do work that protects and manages their ancestral lands. So York Factory is undertaking a whole range of projects related to wildlife and the environment and protection. And all of these are really aimed at, keeping that connection between the community and the land and being active stewards of the land. I'll give you an overview of a number of projects. We won't have time to get into a lot of detail, but if anything interests you, we're wide open to questions after the presentation about whatever piques your interest. And I can clarify also that our firm, HTFC, we've been working, like Adam said, since 2004 as advisors to York Factory on different lands and environment issues. Some of these are projects that we advise on and are team members on, and others are the First Nations initiatives. But I guess first, for at least 15 years, there's been quite a bit of work in York around land use mapping and recording place names, and place names in the Cree language. And all of this is focused on really demonstrating and explaining the community's connection to these areas, even though they seem so far away from where the current reserve community is. So part of it's, demonstrating to others where those connections and knowledge is, and also recording Indigenous place names to keep them alive and keep them used in the community and to have them on maps, giving places the original names that they've always had. There's this very strong focus in York, in the school and in the community on land-based youth programming, focused on getting youth on the land and connected to the land. And these projects are all about making sure that the next generation, still has that connection to the land, that they understand their history, they understand their responsibility as caretakers for the land, and that they have the skills they need to be stewards of that place in the future. York also has an ASKIY NANAKACIHTAKEWIN stewardship program. So this is a community-based monitoring program around the community, staffed with local community members who are drawing on Indigenous knowledge and technical scientific approaches to monitor their area. So these guys are going out on patrols by boat in the summer, by skidoo in the winter. They're out monitoring caribou movements every year when caribou come into the area to see where the animals are moving, what condition they're in, who is harvesting them, and making sure that things are done, respectfully and safely on the land. They're also keeping an eye on water levels, ice conditions on the winter road. You'll appreciate the safety concerns after that picture of the back end of that truck. Monitoring invasive species like zebra mussels that have come into the area, and keeping a good handle on what the impacts are of hydroelectric development, especially with the new KISCHI project that's just finishing construction now. The monitoring program has also initiated a Future Indigenous Guardians program. So this is connected to the monitoring program, and it's a plan to mentor a group of young adults in their 20s, again, to build the skills and the knowledge of the land, really prepare them to be future, their relationship to the land, training and navigation, and some of the monitors. The next slide talks to the KISCHI NAMAO committee. Oh, it doesn't. I've lied to you. The collaboration for ATIKWAK work. Oh, I'll talk about ATIKWAK. So the collaboration around caribou work, this is another project led by York Factory. And this was an effort to bring together 8 First Nations, all sister Cree nations, all of whom, harvest and have a relationship with really the same caribou herds. So although the communities have ended up in all these reserve communities, they're relying on the same animals that are moving through their areas. And so for a couple of years, York had funds and brought these communities together for workshops around sharing, what they were all observing about these herds, concerns they had related to climate change, development, outside harvesting, and sort of disrespectful treatment of animals. And then talking about, what can the communities do as Indigenous stewards to protect caribou? And what's happening now is the communities have all come out of this and said, rather than a bunch of workshops, we would like this to be a permanent committee looking at Indigenous-led caribou stewardship in northeastern Manitoba. So there's work underway now to just set this up as a permanent forum and a permanent place for these nations to work together. Now I can tell you about KISCHI NAMAO. Another wildlife stewardship committee. York is a co-chair of this committee and sits on it with 4 other nations and Manitoba Hydro. And the focus of this group is around stewardship of sturgeon along the lower Nelson River, which is where you saw all of those hydroelectric dams. And there's been so much interruption and disruption of habitat. There are now sturgeon stocking underway, and this committee is really trying to do what they can to support stewardship. So they have scholarships for youth, community involvement at stocking events, and that's what this picture is. They're little 1-year-old sturgeon sort of ready to be released into the river. They have aquariums in the schools and the community with fish, and lots of teaching about traditional practices, respect for the animal, stewardship, and doing what they can to support these animals and their connection to the communities. Next slide. This one's looking a little closer to the home reserve community. And York has really been saying, if we if we are looking to protect all of our ancestral lands, we also need to walk the talk at home. So what you're looking at here is the storage, the bulk storage facility, fuel storage in York Landing. And York has teamed up with Indigenous Services Canada to make sure they've improved their containment, so there's not contamination in the community. There's also a remediation project underway for some contaminated soil, and York will be doing a soil farm, it's called, to turn and remediate and clean the soil right on location, to remediate spills or contamination that's happened in the past. And I think the next discussion in York is really evolving around waste management. When you're a remote northern community, what comes into the community tends to stay in and never leave. And of course, there aren't recycling services offered in these small remote communities, but York is saying, again, if we're going to be leaders in caring for our land, we need to walk the talk at home, and looking at, what are options for recycling, waste management, and using waste in the community as well. One more project we wanted to highlight, and I'll pass that one over to Flora.
Okay, thank you, Elly. This project here is the KITASKIINAN, KAWEKANAWYNICHIKATEK, and in Cree that means protecting our land. KITASKIINAN, KAWEKANAWYNICHIKATEK, protecting our land is a project bringing 5 Indigenous nations together to protect our shared homelands. York Factory First Nation has initiated the project and invites Fox Lake Cree Nation, Shamattawa First Nation, KITASKIIWAK Cree Nation, and War Lake First Nation to join us in this work. Together we want to discuss a possible new Indigenous protected and conserved area in our traditional lands along the Hudson Bay coast. York Factory has accessed funding that will support the communities in working together, in person or virtual meetings, conference calls, depending on safety and restrictions. This includes funding for a working group of the 5 nations that will meet 4 times each year, a part-time community coordinator in each First Nation, a joint site visit to our shared territory. Each First Nation will be funded to hire a community coordinator to learn about the project and share it with community members and leadership, organize the First Nations' involvement in the project, take part in calls with coordinators from the other First Nations, participate in working group meetings, and organize community workshops and meetings to develop a vision for the lands, record cultural and natural values, and gather traditional laws to guide the IPCA. In the First Nations, if the First Nations are in agreement, the groups will work together to develop a shared concept and memorandum of understanding for a new Indigenous protected and conserved area, and identify related protections based in Indian leadership, value, and stewardship. The map that we just saw shows a preliminary area for discussion. This area and the lands adjacent to it have been home to our ancestors since time immemorial. They contain many cultural, historical, spiritual, and natural values that are important to our people. York Factory First Nation does not propose that all of this area be protected, but that First Nations discuss the values within our shared areas and consider what places are best for Indigenous-led protection. The York Factory First Nation has a team consisting of leadership, one of the leadership, and myself as community coordinator, Robin Constant as KITASKIINAN technical project support, and the HTFC planning and design technical and advisory support. So we have a website and can be contacted at any time. IPCAs are lands and waters where Indigenous groups lead the protection and conservation of ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. Culture and language are the heart and soul of an IPCA. Indigenous governments are responsible for setting the conservation standards for IPCAs. They have the full scope to design their IPCAs to meet their specific values and needs. A new Indigenous protected and conserved area can bring ecological, cultural, social, and economic benefits such as connectivity between existing protected areas and increased protected lands, recognition of Indigenous laws and ways of protecting land and water, secured ongoing traditional land use, long-term protection of historical and cultural sites, increased opportunities for nature-based and cultural tourism and travel. This can be accomplished, but we have to work together, and that is the key word. With the 5 nations working together, we can do it. Our ancestors lived on this land for thousands of years and followed their traditional laws. And this is what we would like to see in this protected area, is using our traditional laws and running it as Indigenous people. Today we have had some virtual gatherings with the 5 First Nations. It's really hard to have face-to-face because of COVID right now. We still are planning to have a face-to-face once again on what COVID gives us in the winter. But all the 5 First Nations are in full support of this project. And today we are at our visioning stage. We're going to get our vision together, and from there, I think we'll be able to move on a bit faster as we go along. Do you have anything to add there, Elly?
No, I mean, I guess the comment is that the idea of working towards an Indigenous protected area is about, you know, maintaining that stewardship of the land. It's about connecting people to the land that's part of their culture and their language, healing. But it's also about protecting, you know, the wildlife and the environment in this sort of era of concern around climate change. You know, being able to protect an area this large of highly valuable peatland is critical to, you know, all these discussions around nature-based climate solutions. And there's polar bear and caribou. So the whole idea of the IPCA is it's very much about the communities and their culture and their land, and also very much about the earth and all of society and protecting this home that we all live on together. So the project name KITASKIINAN is really means the land that belongs to all of us. So it's the Cree not saying our land, but they're saying the land that is everybody's land, and looking to protect that. And Adam, I think you have one more video, right? With these are some words from project ceremony, blessing ceremony, and visioning discussion. So you can hear from not just us, but a few more community voices and what they're hoping for around protecting their land.
I was told by elders years ago that all this land here where we were put to live is sacred to every one of us in this area. It's not whose land, it's our land. We were put here by the Creator to look after the land here because it provides for us. What I vision is for the people to come together and work together.
You know, whatever area we agree to protect is for cultural survival. You know, it's where we can go to revive, you know, our identity, revive our language, continue to teach our young people about who they are. That's really critical. So that's why I feel it's so important to protect that area and to be able to govern that area, and for our young people to know this is, you know, where our people are from. This is what our people did there. They had a really close relationship to the land. You know, that's how they survived on the land. That's who they were as Innuit, as Cree people.
I want to see all kinds of people connecting to the land, like our elders, our men, our women, all the youth, even the children. I want to see them all connecting to our land and the water, even to our ancestors, talk to our ancestors, because those places have those lived histories. Everybody's talking about we should go see the land. Everybody has their family that used to live there, talking about their grandmothers and grandfathers living there. There's spirit over there that we need to connect with.
Well, thank you for that presentation. You know, and thank you to Flora for inviting us into your community. I think we felt really blessed that we had that opportunity to have a better understanding of the issues you face and your cohorts, as it were, in the planning area, and who work as your, I guess, for want of a better term, your allies on some of these initiatives. I want to just say to our students that I'm sure you have observations, questions that you'd like to pose to our three guests. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there is an area for inserting those questions. And so we would encourage you to put forward some questions that you might have for any of our three guests. Let me just say, isn't it fascinating how everything seemingly in the world comes full circle? There was a time when so many of these issues we're dealing with around land and biodiversity and water, we thought, well, those are issues, but they're not central to the main issues of our day. And now they have become central to the main issues of our day. You know, when we look at the impact of climate change and as merely one factor around a whole bunch of other factors, biocapacity, biodiversity, et cetera. How do you folks in the planning area, Elly and Adam, how do you kind of reflect on the work that you're undertaking now? It must feel pretty good to do this kind of work.
Well, I think something I've commented on is when I started working with York, I think I started in 2007, but it was because this Kiosk hydroelectric dam was being proposed. And so the resources that the community had to do planning and look at their lands really had to do with a reaction to resource development, you know, and it was funded through that process. And I think what we're seeing now is there's just so much more awareness of you know, the need for protection and the need for Indigenous governance and leadership, that the community now can access resources to do this other work, right? It's not reacting to a developer coming in, it's being proactive with things they want to do. So work like working with 8 nations on CARIBOU and working on this Indigenous protected area. I mean, these are projects that the nations want to lead proactively, and they're now able to access money from, you know, foundation supporters, from the federal government. There's money and there's resources available because people want to support this kind of work. And it allows the nations to do some of that really proactive stewardship work. So yeah, exciting for us to be part of, and less of a defensive, reactive work and more of a proactive, positive initiative. So.
Adam, did you see this as the kind of work you would be undertaking when you graduated from your post-secondary education?
I think this is exactly the kind of work that I wanted to be getting involved with. I think this is, I mean, it's exciting. It's exciting to be working for you know, the future of our planet, and also to you know, to support Indigenous communities around us. That as settlers we have you know, have to reconcile the works that have done and the harm that especially, you know, planners in the past and environmental resource, you know, in our line of work, right? It was often our fields that were causing a lot of harm to these communities as well. And so, yeah, I think it's part of our responsibility now as planners to reverse and work, you know, to undo some of those harms that were caused in the past. And so, I mean, I just wanted to say to all those on the call here, all the students, I think this is an exciting time for you to be students in this line of work as well. And I think this is a great time of opportunity to do good work. And so I think, yeah, to go forward, and I think to listen to these stories, I think is really important framework to ground yourselves as you go out into the work world after this. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, we're so happy that we could share this with you today.
Flora, you've seen, I could say this because I'm somewhat of an older person in myself. I can say this. You've seen a lot in your lifetime. You've seen a lot of, I suppose, consultants come. You've seen a lot of people that, you know, thought they were doing good. You've seen a lot of people that brought a lot of misery. What were some of the thoughts that you had, and how did HTFC go about building that trust with you and your community, the York Factory First Nation? How did they do that?
Well, with myself, like you said, I have seen a lot. Yeah, and they worked with us so well with each project, different projects, and you know, they were honest and fair. And with us as Indigenous people, when we do different projects, we're told to go slow. Don't try and hurry things along, because if you make mistakes, you might not be able to go back to that. So with these lessons, you know, from the elders and the teachings, you know, we follow those, and then we in turn tell, you know, our planners and that what we'd like. And you know, I'm really thankful that they're there, you know, because you could see I had a hard time connecting this morning. I'm not very good with computers, but but they're always there to help. And this young man who's my technical support, which is good, you know. But then we've just been able to work together real well. And you know, when this project came up, I was retired. I was already retired, and when I saw the posting, I said, "Gee, I think I'll try for that." And I got it because that's right up my alley, like the land, everything, the environment, people. That is my life's work. And here I am today.
Yep. Adam and Elly, we hear a lot about issues around drinking water in First Nations communities. What's the status of fresh water in these communities, and what more needs to be done, and what has been done, and what are the prospects for the future in terms of providing water treatment and fresh water?
Maybe I can jump in on that. Yeah, I guess in York Landing, you know, we do hear about people when they first arrived in York Landing in 1957, they would, you know, stick a cup in the lake and could drink it, right? And of course, with hydroelectric development and all the change that has come, that's not possible anymore. And there's been, a lot more turbidity in the water, so they're right on a highly regulated system. So the drinking water is still coming out of the lake in front of the community. There have been problems for years and years and years with water treatment. So there was a water treatment facility, but it hasn't been able to handle the conditions of the water. Some of it to do with the water affected from the lake, and then there's a river coming in, and depending where those mixing points move. So there have been lots of technical shortcomings in the water treatment system, and it's hard to say if that comes from the amount of money available or the resources available for planning. York did recently, the federal government has acknowledged that they have a responsibility to provide clean potable water to York. And they have done major water treatment plant upgrades in the last number of years. Although within a year of that, there were, I think last year, 6 weeks of water shutdown, and the community went into a state of emergency and had to bring in water and all sorts of backup solutions. And I think even now they're having more complications and all sorts of extra pipes and pumps running. So it's for York, even with new investment from Indigenous Services Canada, it's an ongoing challenge. Yeah, I don't know the details to know exactly what's next. And I know that Split Lake, KITASKIIWAK First Nation just across the water, I think they've been on boil water advisory for at least a year. So again, lots of small communities with continued problems, even where there is, dialogue and some efforts by the federal government. I don't know, Flora, what can you add on drinking water?
It's just that I use bottled water. We have the treatment plant has osmosis water that we can use. Sometimes when we have problems with the water, right away we're told not to use the tap water, so we can either use that or get bottled water.
Yeah. The other issue that came up was the lack of really cold days and the necessity of being able to bring in supplies across the ice. How in the future, given that it's likely that we'll see more and more of that rising temperatures, how in the future are those items going to be addressed? Adam, do you have some insight into that?
I mean, this has been, I think, an ongoing concern for a long time. It always seems every year that the winter road period gets shorter and shorter, and so being down to a few weeks in certain situations. Maybe Elly can speak more on this, but I do believe that York Factory has been looking for alternative solutions for an all-season road to be built that would kind of get around there, and so would provide an alternate access. But we know these are multi-million-dollar projects that are you have to fight for funds and from other places too. So yeah, Elly, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, for decades there's been talk of working towards an all-season road, but right now there is a team together and a concerted effort, with the provincial and federal representatives and trying to get some energy towards all-season access. I think the winter road is an issue. There's a ferry in the summer, but there's about half of the year when it's a fly-in only community. And the ferry, even we've had droughts this summer, and the ferry's capacity limits were restricted. So it creates all sorts of challenges around food security, bringing in equipment. Even that soil remediation project that I talked about has been put on hold because the equipment that had to come in was too large to go on the ferry with limited restrictions. And so they're now waiting until, maybe January when something can come in over the road. So the amount of costs around sort of food security, cost of living, issues with infrastructure projects, they can only be done in certain seasons. It's a huge bottleneck for servicing the community.
Well, I want to thank Flora Beardy. I want to thank Elly, Bonny. I want to thank Adam Kroeker for your presentation, your insight, your sharing really of so many stories, and progress, we like to think, challenges, obviously, and future prospects in your work.